Welcome to the Anti-Architect Podcast. I am your host, Christian Giordano. As president and owner of the design firm Mancini Duffy, I am driven by a quest for learning and radically changing the industry. With this podcast, I'm hoping to improve the industry that I'm so passionate about by taking a critical look at how architects work through a variety of voices and shared experiences. Hello, Anti-Architect Podcast listeners. I'm excited to have Julie Engh, Associate AIA Lead AP, as my guest on the Anti-Architect Podcast. Julie is joining via Zoom today while I'm recording in our Red Bank, New Jersey studio. Julie is a project manager and owner's rep at Watershed Partners, an employee-owned project management firm specializing in retail, hospitality, institutional, healthcare, and residential projects. After nearly 2 decades of leading design and construction through all project phases, Julie's professional expertise bridges architectural history, construction management, and design. Julie is passionate about adaptive reuse of historic buildings. She interned at New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission and oversaw education programs for Gotham Center before moving into architectural practice. Julie spent over a decade providing architectural services to clients in retail, hospitality, mission-critical, commercial, and residential projects. 6 years ago, she began providing owner's rep services and project management services, leading projects for mission-driven organizations in the Hudson Valley and New York City. As a founding member and co-chair of the AIA New York Architecture Tour Committee, Julie co-developed the AIA New York Boat and Walking Tour programs throughout New York City. Julie, thank you so much for taking the time to be here on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I would love to start with the architecture boat tour and walking tour. And I am sad to say that living in New York City for almost 20 years, I have never done this tour. That's pretty pathetic. I guess my question would be, what's wrong with me? Tell us about the boat tour. What is it all about? How long did you do this? How did you figure that out?
Absolutely. It's truly a wonderful program, and I highly recommend it for folks who've lived here for decades upon decades and people who are just stopping in and visiting the city for a brief time. It's such a wonderful way to experience the built environment of New York City and get a new perspective on what you normally experience either walking or in a car or on the subway. The story behind how the American Institute of Architects New York chapter launched these programs, it really ties back to actually Classic Harbor Line, the boat tour operator, approached the AIA New York chapter and said, we see great things about the Chicago architecture boat tour. It's, if you go to Chicago, you do that tour. Why don't we have one here in New York? We have great architecture too. And I think that outreach from Classic Harbor Line, that sort of lead came in, and Abby Suckle was the, I believe, vice president for public outreach at the time at the AIA New York chapter. And so she worked to put together this sort of call for, are you an architect? Do you like boats? Do you want to put those two together and come help us build this tour program? At the time, I was working in residential architecture. We had just had, quite a bit of decline in work around the recession of 2007, 8, 9. It was just a wonderful moment to step into a room with a group of architects who love this city. We put a map essentially on the table and talked through, okay, this boat will circumnavigate Manhattan. What do we have to talk about? And as you can imagine, we picked enough buildings to talk for about 24 hours straight, since the boat tour the circumnavigation of Manhattan takes a little under 3 hours. So it was a bit of trial and error to get that pacing correct. But ultimately, we worked together as a team. Everyone sort of shared research and collaborated. We started by having 3 guides on the boat working together. And ultimately, as we polished the presentation, refined the content, it's down to one tour guide knows this all by memorization and can do the tour by themselves with no notes. It's really remarkable.
And it's still active
So
today?
it is still very active. The AIANY New York chapter manages the program internally now with staff for, I'd say, almost 10 years, was involved in the program in some capacity, either as a co-chair of the committee, as an active tour guide, or as a sort of helpful mentor who would just take a look at programming or come out on the boat and offer feedback and advice. The core group of guides is incredibly active. They keep up on their research. They practice constantly. They give feedback to each other. They work with the boat tour company and the AIA to consistently revitalize, what's new on the waterfront, what should we be talking about now, and also expanding the type of tour. There's so much to see on the waterfront that you can pick these themes and focus on sustainability, historic buildings, climate change, rising tides, all these individual content pieces can be woven together in tours so that if folks want to go out on the boat multiple times a year, they know that they're getting a baseline set of content where you're not going to miss the architectural highlights, but your tour guide is going to weave the story, connecting them in a different way based on that thematic focus.
Very cool. Where does it leave out of?
Chelsea Piers.
Okay.
And so depending on the conditions of the day, the boat typically will leave south. Every once in a while, they have to go north first. That is a decision from the boat tour captain that I will not try to make any sort of comment on why they make those decisions, but it works wonderfully both ways. There's different ways to sort of start the content, whether you go north or south, but the tour circumnavigates the island. So you get to go under all the bridges on the Harlem River. And then when you emerge back out on the Hudson, you sort of pass through the Spite and Dival crossing as that rotation bridge opens for you. Typically carries the Amtrak train north and south.
That's great. All right, cool. I'm going to make a promise that I'm going to this summer take my kids and we're going to do this because it sounds great. So that's awesome. Thanks for sharing.
Most fun you can have getting 3 HSW continuing education credits.
I love it. I love it. So, and I also want to talk about landmarks because I thought that was really interesting. It's something I didn't know about you, that you'd worked at landmarks. And I will say, we practice a lot in New York City. That's probably the bulk of our work. And we deal with landmarks a lot. And, most people you say the word landmarks and they get nervous. They think, oh my God, this is it's over. We're never going to get a project built. But actually, I'll say that, beyond the fact that it does extend a schedule, right? And there's an approval process as part of it, which you would understand. It's actually not a terrible experience to work with landmarks on landmarks projects. And it's actually very specific, right? That you follow those rules, you follow what they need, and you will get approvals. People always think in New York City, oh my God, how do you get anything done? But actually building in New York City is pretty straightforward. You follow the rules, it's all done online, and you get your permit. It's actually easier to build in New York City than it is sometimes to build in the middle of nowhere, New Jersey, because they do really know what they're doing in New York. So just curious about your experience at landmarks, and was there anything crazy that kind of stands out that was like, no way, that'll never get approved?
My experience working at the Landmark Preservation Commission, which I'll abbreviate to LPC, was limited to an internship that I did while I was at NYU as part of my course of studies for the Metropolitan Studies degree. So I actually worked in the compliance department as an intern, which was essentially 2 violations officers responsible for fielding all of the public outreach of potential permit violations. Those 2 officers were responsible for the entire city, for every single landmark structure, trying to get out and investigate these potential violations, write the report, check it against the permits, and then issue a violation or not. So when I came on board, I ultimately became the fieldwork person. So every day I'd show up, they'd give me a camera, a list of sites, let me know what I needed to document, and I would get out, hit the pavement, take photographs of everything, try to make sure nobody sort of realized exactly what I was doing, and get out of the area if necessary. But it was such a wonderful experience to get to see on the other side of the table, how does the commission operate? Who's doing what? Where are the holdups? And for the two violations officers at the time, it was just time. They had so many, so much public outreach, and the way that the process is managed is there's no automatic regulatory compliance check. So they are fielding, folks in the community who are reaching out and saying, I think there might be something going on here that shouldn't. And they're taking that public, outreach, and they're translating that into a permit or violation report. And so having my time available to go out and do the more time intensive part of this process really freed them up. And in the first month I was there, they said they cleared a unprecedented number of, potential violations and had issued these reports out at a rate that they had never processed before. So they were just grateful that I was able to plug in as a intern, going out and doing this work and taking the photographs, because that was something that could be handed off to someone who was very junior. For me, it was a great learning experience because I love this city. I love historic buildings. So just that simple act of being handed a camera and sent a list of addresses in a neighborhood maybe I wasn't familiar with, it was a great use of my time. But then also back in the office, making those connections, meeting the folks in the various departments, seeing how they all work together. And since this was part of my course of study at NYU, there was a lot of report writing and research that I did accompanying my internship, like actual hours in the field, so that I was learning how the Preservation Commission was put together, what was the impetus for founding this organization in New York City, the history of Penn Station and Grand Central, and the sort of the history of the preservation law in the city and the state. So I appreciate the way you framed that, in that working with landmarks, when you follow the rules and you know the process and you approach it in the right manner, it really doesn't have to be a difficult or frustrating process. LPC has gone one step further lately, and they've launched a new permitting process that can be done online. And so I look forward to digging in on that and learning how to use this new tool that they've put out for the community to make this an even easier and more simple process.
Yeah. That sounds like an amazing learning experience too, just in general, being part of that, really sort of the inner workings of it. Very cool. So if you had to pick one thing, what annoys you about architects?
Well, as I can speak from my experience when I practiced architecture, I was guilty of this, and I was consistently told that I was too detail oriented. And I think that with so many architects, our brains are thinking 10 steps ahead, because we're already thinking, okay, this decision is going to impact this, and this. And you're thinking this whole process through. Whereas a lot of clients and a lot of teams, they need you to be thinking, okay, we get that. We just need steps maybe 1 and 2, and we'll get to steps 3 through 10 later. But can we focus on this upfront piece? So I think to some extent, we all can be a little guilty of that, in terms of trying to solve everything at once and think through the question or the problem slightly further than we need to at each stage of the process. At schematic design, we're really thinking about some of those finishing details.
Sure.
When the client is just not there yet, or the project or the team. So I would say learning how to prioritize the sort of design approach and focus on the big picture, and recognize at what stage you need to be doing what level of analysis and design is one of the things that I think we could benefit from.
So I want to ask you a little bit of, questions about, the project management side of things and more of what you're doing, these days. And I interviewed a friend and colleague, Fred Biscaglia, on a previous episode when he was with JLL, and he's on the project management side as well. And Fred's opinion was that architects should embrace, and I wrote it down to make sure I got it right, architects should embrace and want to use a project manager. So I pose that same question that I did to him, to you, is why should we embrace and want a client to hire a project manager?
My goal as a project manager is to make everyone on the team's job and life easier. My goal is not to create extra processes that are just wasting time or asking for information that's unnecessary or making you run through hoops or anything. The goal is that we're taking pressure off of the architect, especially in terms of client communication. So, over the last 6 years, I've worked with a lot of nonprofit organizations where the capital project that we're working on for design and construction is going to be the single most money that organization spends, if not in that decade, I mean, potentially even in the life of the organization. And so for that nonprofit, communication and reporting and oversight is so important that their board is getting the information that they should have on a timely and regular manner. When they go and hire an architect, when they expect certain things and the architect says, well, that's not entirely in my scope, that's part of where we come in and can really take that pressure off, where the architect should be focusing on providing a good, thorough, thought out design that's code compliant, meets the client's needs, coordinating their subconsultants, making sure that, all the engineered trades are working with their architectural design. They shouldn't have to be the ones doing that level of communication and reporting unless they want to. Of course, that, for some architects, that's part and parcel of what they would love to be doing on the project. And I think a lot of architects are great at that. They're great communicators. They present really well. They can communicate information to groups of people who have different levels of understanding of architectural drawings and projects. But on some level, there might just not be enough time available.
Yeah.
And so having that extra support on the project management side, our goal is to be making things easier. And also when there's these conversations with clients of, oh, well, why do I need this extra vendor? Why do I need this other consultant? Or how does this process work? We can then sort of pull that back and take that off on a side conversation and handle that and make sure that the project is properly scoped. We have a realistic budget, that the schedule is functioning and, to meet their needs. But I think one of our biggest roles is to make sure that early on in the project, we are setting the right priorities and that we're scoping the right level of project. All too many times we have, I've actually been brought in on projects where the client had unfortunately failed with multiple architects because they kept having the wrong fit, or this architect designed us exactly what we wanted, but we didn't know it was 10 times what we could afford. And the architect didn't communicate that. That client would say, oh, we assumed that the architect would communicate that to us. And it's a really difficult situation to be in where the client is technically getting exactly what they asked for because the architect is drawing exactly what they've been asked to do. However, that connection of, well, who's pricing this, who's doing the feasibility analysis around the permitting and the scheduling and the timeline, all of those things are parts of the project that we can come in. And if we're engaged early, make sure that the scope, budget, and the schedule are aligned and there are no large disconnects that are going to just create issues for everyone down the road.
Yeah. No, I get it. In your bio, you reference both project manager and owner's representative, or owner's rep is really what we call it, right? Mm-hmm. What are the key distinctions in terms of responsibilities between a PM and an owner's rep? Because I think that we as an industry kind of get those things confused.
I'll give my personal response to that, which is not necessarily fully based on technical literature or what's necessarily maybe being taught in school. But from my perspective, the project manager role is more about inserting into a project where maybe the team's already set, the scope is sort of already put together, the site's selected, the client, things are sort of already set up. And you are there to facilitate communication, reporting, meeting minutes, agendas, scheduling, timelines, and making sure everyone's talking together and you're moving things forward. I see the owner's representative role as being a little bit more embedded into the client side of the project and making sure that you are going one step further and offering recommendations, best practices, that you are working with the client to inform their decisions more. I would never consider it my role to tell a client what to do, but I do think that we are making recommendations. We're writing trade award recommendations or consultant award recommendations, and we're leveling things, and we're having those conversations with them about, well, this may be the lowest bidder, but here are all the reasons why you might not want to go with the lowest bidder, and let's go a few steps further and vet these potential consultants or contractors or team members. So I would say, from my perspective, I do see a distinction there in terms of the amount of feedback and recommendations and sort of really being inserted into the client team in a different manner as an owner's rep.
Yeah. I've also heard, and I don't know, maybe this is like an old school reference, but I've also heard where, back in the day, an owner's rep truly had the voice of the client, right? Where they could make decisions for a client. I mean, I can't imagine that these days, even from a legal point of view, if anyone would ever want to actually do that. But yeah, I agree. I think there's the PM role, and then there is that more like embedded with the client kind of side of an owner's rep. So, as you've kind of worked through the project management role, where do you see projects go like off track, right? Like give me some examples of some projects where that happens.
Sure. I think early on, unrealistic expectations from any of the major players around the table. It could be the owner, the architect, contractor, or any of the big three. If you have any of those three out of alignment, there's going to be major issues in the project. I think that sometimes owners do not recognize that they have a responsibility to the project, that they have to meet certain, you have to have a certain level of, this is what we want to build, or this is the project we envision. And if you don't have that fully formed, that when you are engaging a team, you're engaging them to work with you to scope the project. It's not the architect's responsibility to come in and tell you what your project is, unless that's what you want. Architects, I think, are great at so many things that if someone said, I want to open a restaurant, I'm going to hire an architect who does thousands of restaurants. I know a little bit about what I want my food to be, and I have a chef, but you tell me what it should look like, and you tell me with this site how many seats it should have. There's a certain level that the architect is absolutely going to be able to turn around into a successful project. But there's a level of business planning and operations planning that also needs to happen to inform what the architect's doing. So if the owner or the client is not doing their due diligence and their work, that project is not going to succeed, unless you really have to look at how the owner defines success. They may say, no, success to us is that this looks beautiful and it has great restaurant reviews, and we're in all the architectural design, publications, and we're winning design awards. But if we're losing money every year, that's fine, because this is what we really care about. So it's I think early on, priority and goal setting and defining what is a successful project to the owner, and communicating that effectively to the team, starting with the design team and the architect, and then that flows through down to once you engage a contractor and start construction.
Yeah, and that project that you described sounds amazing, right? On paper. The problem with that is that how do you then put a cost to that, right? How does the architect put a fee to something like that, right? These open-ended sort of, well, I'm not exactly sure what the scope is, but I need to know how much it's going to cost to design it and do construction and whatever, parts of the project that we're talking about, seeing it all the way through. It becomes so difficult to price those kind of things, and you automatically start out as not as opposition, but with so many questions, and the questions then turn into, well, I didn't think it was going to be that, and how did that cost so much, or why are you doing that? So I agree, scope is really key. I think it's one of the key things that a project manager can do too, is really define the scope of what every single person on that team is doing. And then holding the client accountable too and saying, hey, this is what everyone agreed to do. Now we're off on this tangent here, which is fine. It may be great, but we got to acknowledge we're now off on a tangent here. So
absolutely. And then when the architect comes back and says, okay, well, this is, the design ad service for all this work, and the client doesn't understand that that was ad service and extra work because, doesn't the architect sit with me at the table and figure this out? And we say, the architect can absolutely do that. It just needs to be defined upfront and part of their scope. And then they may have a fee adjustment once the project scope is determined and what you're moving forward with.
And as far as on the PM side, the budgeting, right? To me, and I've said this on the podcast a million times, architects have no idea what anything costs. We're always notoriously terrible at that. We either overestimate it and then kill the project, or we underestimate it and then we're just, looked upon as, but you told me it was going to be $100 a foot and it's $500 a foot. And how could this have happened? And so I really, as, horrible as this might sound, I try to avoid the cost conversation when it comes to actually building something because we don't really know what the costs are. It fluctuates. There's so many unknowns, especially early in a project. We could tell you how much the last restaurant that we designed costs, right? And, what they spent on it and why. But that doesn't apply to the next restaurant, not even for the same owner. And we do a lot of I'm just using restaurants as an example, but we do a lot of restaurants for the same owner and they vary. They could cost $8 million in one restaurant and they can cost $2.5 million in another restaurant, right? And that's for a myriad of different reasons, right? Either it's conditions or the marketplace requires more to be spent in some place versus another, or maybe the conditions of the it's in New York versus in whatever, right? Somewhere else. So there's all those sort of things. What are the tools that you use to help control budget and things like that and cost?
Great question. From our perspective, probably the number one conversation we have with new clients is around that very point, in that you could say you have X hundreds of thousands of dollars and you need to build a new building in Manhattan, and we can automatically tell you those two things are not aligned. So it genuinely depends on, when we approach a project, what level of certainty do they need around their budgeting, and really defining that up front. And like I said, for nonprofits, it often is, we were given a donation of X dollars, or we received a grant of X dollars. So we have a fixed budget for this project. We cannot go over it. And so then we work with them and we break down standard percentages and we say, okay, this is what you should expect for soft costs, hard costs, contingencies, FF&E, et cetera, and really work with them up front to set what can we even build, or help them understand that actually you're not where you need to be. If you need a whole new building, you're about 50% through your fundraising. You need to keep fundraising. There's no reason to start a project right now. So once we can align expectations going into the process, what we typically will recommend, if a client has to have that firm budgeting happening side by side through design, that we have to hire a CM for pre-construction. There has to be someone at the table who is bidding and building jobs in the market consistently. And you can do that with a standalone cost controls consultant as well. They bring great value to the project. What we've often seen is that the design team, and again, it can go either way. With the wrong CM at the table, it's not going to be successful, but that with the right partnership, it actually becomes a benefit to both parties, because the architects and the engineers are working through some complicated constructability questions, and the CM at the table can say, actually, there's a better way to do this. What if we did this, 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 and this? Or have you thought about this? And finding ways to create those relationships in a positive manner and bringing someone in early has a lot of benefits around the budgeting and, making sure these constructability questions are answered early on. On the flip side, we have a lot of clients who also want to go out to competitive bid, and they believe they'll realize savings off of that process, which, depending on when you go out to bid and what kind of project and what kind of firms, there's there's truth to that statement as well. So it is challenging. And we try to work with architects and teams who, we have a good sense of, okay, these drawings are progressing. Let's take them to an estimator and just get some order of magnitude pricing, or, we've set this per square foot allowance, this architect, we can work together and make sure that the drawings are moving along in that range, but we're not giving you a defined number. So there's the different levels of really how much the client needs on the budgeting side versus what the team is capable of doing, and flushing the team out more to provide it.
Sure.
If needed.
Oh, that's great. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about selecting an architect, because I think it's beneficial to the audience to kind of see like an insider's look, right? So you have, as a project manager, you have a hand in selecting the architect. What does that process look like? And I know not all the times, but a lot of times you give out RFPs, and, what are you looking for? How do, give us some inside clues.
That question is so multi-layered and so dependent on the project, the client. I would say it ranges anywhere from having a client that is doing something that maybe there is no project direct comparison. I mean, first you typically look for, okay, I'm doing an office interior renovation in X building. Do I have a stable of great interior, corporate architects that I feel like there's dozens where you don't have a bad option, and that's great. But some clients are more comfortable with small firms. Some clients want a big corporate firm. That to me is a huge differentiator between who's on my bid list for going out to talk to architects. Now, to the point that some buildings have architects who know them so well that you really benefit from someone who's done a bunch of projects in one building, because they know the ins and outs. They can really help work with the building staff, the existing conditions, and they may or may not be the right fit for the client. So that takes it, there's just so many levels to that. But I would say from my perspective, we start with what architects do we like working with, that we have worked with before, or we know people who've worked with before, who know how to do this typology in this market, in this location, and going from there and whittling it down to the actual right fit. Oh, it's such a multi-layered connection that we sometimes explain this to our clients of, it's almost, for some projects, they're years long. It's almost like you're entering into a long-term relationship that you need to think about personalities more. I mean, how was this culture fit in this initial meeting? Did everyone get along well? Did you feel you could communicate with the team that the architecture firm was putting forward? Because sometimes that will rise up to the top of, maybe you haven't done a bunch of restaurants or corporate interiors or whatever typology the project is, but you have a really great connection with the firm, the culture of the firm. They're a right fit for their, maybe you have a mission-driven organization that's looking for specific things about a firm with social justice or environmentalism. Those things matter to a lot of clients, and finding firms that connect with them on those levels can be that push of, why they're brought in on a project.
Yeah, I always think, we do have projects that sometimes go on for years and years. And we had just project that just finished up in Times Square that was 7 years long. We've entered into a new project in New Jersey that is a campus project that's probably going to go for at least 5, could even go for 10, depending upon, all the different phases and things like that. I always wanted to say, we should probably start, before we get into anything else, just, let's have a happy hour and make sure we all want to be together, because you're going to be together potentially on a weekly basis for years and or a decade to come. Some of these things take so long and they're so massive, and you're spending billions of dollars, that you got to really like those people, and somehow hold the team together through lots of changes and all sorts of stuff. So that's a good point. It's a lot of fit. I agree. When have you seen an architect kind of fall on their face in a presentation when trying to win a job? Like, have you seen where they've just done something so obviously not good? What advice do you have when entering a presentation for an architect?
Sure. I'll actually say it wasn't an architect, it was a contractor. And so different,
Sure.
absolutely different presentation styles, but there was one that I distinctly remember early during the COVID pandemic where we were doing everything over Zoom because everyone needed to be, socially distanced. And there was a contractor who did a Zoom and he said, well, I have 9 people in the room with me. You can't see them, but they're all sitting right next to me. And we were just like, no, you shouldn't have 10 people in a room right now. That's actually why we're doing all of this on Zoom, and there were no in-person meetings. And so it was kind of that, this client sort of prided themselves that we were all respecting that, no one felt safe. This was very early in the pandemic, that we were trying to respect that we were putting a project together during a very difficult time. And we wanted team members that respected that we would all work together collaboratively, but that we wouldn't be putting anyone in any unsafe conditions. And so that really set a very poor tone for that potential contractor. And ultimately they did not get the job. But I remember the client coming back from that interview and just saying, I like, no, there's no way we would hire someone who is putting that out as a positive thing right now. And so that stuck in my mind as the thing that really was probably the worst example. From an architect's perspective, I will say I've had some pretty good luck that most of the architect presentations I've seen for potential engagement on projects, it's actually been really difficult to choose because they've all done so well.
Yeah.
And so going back with the client afterwards, it really became, of all the different stakeholders on the client side, what are you looking for? And what boxes are each of these firms checking, and coming back to them and saying, okay, we'd like to hear a little bit more about this, or more about this, and more about this. But I am very grateful that I think part of the benefit of working with project managers who know the industry is that I haven't had a moment where the architect was an absolute horrible fit for the client in the interview process, because they said, okay, we see the value of each of these firms for different reasons. And then coming out of the interview, the client was actually better able to communicate. Now that we've talked to all these people, we understand better what we're looking for. And we didn't know it going into this process, but we actually do want a bigger firm. We don't want a small firm. So right. Say a firm that came in that was very small and did the presentation, they'd say, now we understand that we do need a bigger, we need more staff on this project. And we didn't know that going in.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, your childhood. Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to college?
I grew up in Southern California in Huntington Beach. So nice. Beautiful Orange County, wonderful weather. Everyone thought I was crazy to move back here and go to NYU, start to experience some wonderful winter weather. But I loved it. So I moved out here in 2002. And after NYU, I actually started work at the Gotham Center for New York City History, which is a small nonprofit that runs education programs for New York City public school history teachers. And they do all this great programming around teaching American history through the lens of New York City history. So what was going on in New York City at the time? How can we relate that to American history? So I got this really wonderful, about, first year out of college experience running programs with all of the historic societies in the city, museums, libraries, and bringing all these great public school teachers in for events. And it was wonderful. Concurrently, I was learning AutoCAD, getting interested in architecture. I knew that was something I'd always been interested in, but NYU doesn't have an architecture school. So I had taken all of the architectural history, metropolitan studies, study of the city, urban design, AutoCAD. And it was a very interesting moment that in 2006, in the same week, I got 3 calls on my resume from architecture firms. So there must have been something in the air where everyone was looking to hire really junior people. And all 3 were interested and willing to train me. They said, as long as you know how to use AutoCAD, that's okay. We'll build up the building blocks from there. And so I learned, you start with the components, bathrooms, stairs, kitchens, door schedules, details. And yeah, so that's how it all began, and went from residential and historic building conversions to a firm that does sort of everything else. So retail, data centers, Ellis Island, Nobu, 195 Broadway, which was a mixed use interior landmark office lobby that we converted into a smaller office lobby with 3 retail spaces. And then from there, I went into corporate interiors and then into project management.
So fast forward to Watershed. Tell us a little bit about the company. What kind of projects do you work on? I know you also mentioned that you work with a lot of nonprofits. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So Watershed Partners, as you mentioned, it's a employee-owned and managed project management firm. So they have a really broad range of specialty, which I appreciate. They do a lot of retail, hospitality, institutional, healthcare, and residential projects all over the country. And so I appreciate that there are project managers at Watershed all over the country, but also if you work with a client and they have projects all over the country, you may be traveling or you may be coordinating with someone who's more local to work on that project, but that there's always a connection to whoever is that client's long-standing, team member, that how this client works. So it may be you going to their site, or it may be somebody who's more local jumping in. I also appreciate that they can, if they recognize that they need someone local and they don't have someone, they can hire on consultants as needed, and that there's a great vetting process, making sure they have the right skills and expertise. But that recognition that our industry flexes up and down in terms of workload, and one year this client may have 2 projects, and next year they may have 15 projects. So you want to be able to provide the same level of service on a 2 project year as a 15 project year. And how do you make sure that happens? And so when I moved over to Watershed about 6 months ago, I did come from a background of working mostly with nonprofits and, sort of larger institutional clients. And that's continued. And so they've supported that through the last 6 months. And I'm looking at doing some summer projects for a Institute of Higher Education in the city. So as you're well aware, the summer months pick up with all the academic work. And so a lot of that is getting designed and bid right now and kicking off, of course, after graduation over the summer months.
Yeah, those are always hectic, those kind of projects.
They sure can be, yes.
So as we wrap up here, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to discuss?
Well, I will say that one thing that I have found to be of a lot of interest in my career has been focusing on how architects particularly, and the extension of architects to just the whole project team, as we do projects in the built environment, we are impacting people in every facet of their everyday life. I just find that fascinating. And so I'm very grateful that we've seen over the course, especially of my career, sustainability becoming such an important topic in design and construction, and really looking at how can we make design and construction both more sustainable for the environment, but also more healthy for the end user. Like, how do we look at your office space as the place that you may actually spend more time there than at home sometimes? I mean, you're in your it used to be that you were at your desk, at least 8 hours a day. And so how do we create a healthy and happy environment for that? So I think from my perspective, I'm really appreciating seeing the shift in the way that design projects are approached to ensure that sustainability component is brought in early, And now we're seeing it go even further where we're looking to be, how can design foster equity in the built environment for everyone? And how can we make it so that everyone has access to good design, everyone has access to healthy living and workspaces? So I would say that those are the topics I'm really interested to see more of in our industry, and hear, how we can become better practicers of, how do we facilitate a more sustainable and just environment.
Nice.
Built environment, excuse me.
That's awesome. Well, Julie, thank you so much for being a guest here today on the Anti-Architect podcast. I love, I'm trying to get an insight into, different parts of the profession and how others see architects. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So to learn more about Julie Engh, you can find her on LinkedIn. You just search for her. And then for Watershed Partners, it's watershedpartners.com, and you'll see all about them there. So thank you again. Really appreciate it.